3-game weekend series in Pittsburgh against the really struggling Pittsburgh Pirates. That'll wrap up a 10-game road trip before we go back home. But anyways, let's get into the second segment of the show, and we'll start with the Pittsburgh Pirates and what they've done the last week. And it's been very poor for them. Clint Hurdle really has to go. They led today's game by a score of 8-4 after 6 innings against St. Louis Cardinals. They then gave up 5 runs in the 7th to make it 9-8 before make it 11-8, putting down 2 more runs in the 8th inning. As the Pirates, I believe they got swept. They had to have gotten swept. Yeah, they got swept. And against the Brewers, they got swept. Against the Mets, they lost 2-3 last weekend. So this week for the Pittsburgh Pirates, they go 0-6. First game against the Brewers, they lost by a couple of runs. And the second game, they only lost by a run. But that was at PNC Park. They got swept by Milwaukee, who was struggling coming into that series. And then, as was just aforementioned, the Cardinals swept them at Busch Stadium. Up next for the Pirates, it's not going to get any easier. They have a tough 3-game set against the Angels. That's going to be out in LA, which is a very odd out west. Just one series for that road trip before they have to come back home to host the Cubs, which is going to be a tough series for them. After that, it's going to be the Nationals, Reds, Phillies. I mean, they really have a tough schedule, and it's not looking good for them whatsoever. When you look at the standings, Pittsburgh has fallen all the way to 13.5 back, 21 games under 500. And then, like I said, 26-58 against teams above 500, 1-9 in their last 10. They've lost 8 in a row. Just terrible. Negative 100 run differential. So Clint Hurdle really needs to go. He has, been blind to baseball analytics for years now, but now that it's such a big part of the game, more than it's ever been, it's just even more glaring how badly he needs to go. And I know a good amount of Pirate fans myself, and most of them agree, and that says something for a guy in Clint Hurdle that's been there a very long time. Anyways, let's move on. We'll do the Cincinnati Reds next. Obviously, they split the series with us. Believe that's our last series. It's got to be our last series in Cincy for the year. But when you look at their series before that, earlier this week, they faced the Angels at home on Monday and Tuesday. They had Wednesday off, and they actually swept the Angels in a mini 2-game set. They won Game 1 by a score of 7-4, and then won on Tuesday by a score of 8-4. So pretty good week for the Reds. Going 4-2 on the week. They'll actually head out on the road now for a 3-game set versus the Nationals at the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. And then they'll host the Cardinals next weekend, which will be a big series for the Cardinals and also for the Reds because they're still alive in the division, anything, because especially with the arrival of Trevor Bauer, the 11 strikeouts against us, and Luis Castillo, Sonny Gray, Alex Wood is healthy. I mean, that's a dangerous starting rotation all of a sudden. And we've seen that guys like, Josh Van Meter have really stepped up. You still have the likes of and of course Aquino, but you still have the likes of Votto, Suarez, a pretty good, solid foundation, Winker. The Reds are a pretty good ball club, and I'm not going to sit here and say that they're not a threat. So a 4-2 week for them. Like I said, they'll go to Washington, and then they'll host the Cardinals for their next 2 series. Let's do the Milwaukee Brewers now before we do St. Louis Cardinals because, of course, the Cardinals are the absolute worst. And today, I didn't even know this, but today the Brewers actually got shut out against the Rangers, luckily, because they would have swept the Rangers. That was at Miller Park. It was a 1-0 game. Yesterday's game, they won 3-2. And the game before that, game 1 on Friday, they won 6-5. So every one of those every one of those games in this series was a one-run game. It would have been unfortunate if the Rangers hadn't won one. But before that, I guess we talked about this before, but they swept the Pirates. So a really good week for the Brewers, 5-1. They find themselves just 2.5 back now. And they're only a half game back, I believe, in the wild card to the St. Louis Cardinals, who own the second spot there. I just want to double check that. Yep, so they're a half game back, and then like I said, the Mets are a game back, Philly a game and a half, Arizona 3, and San Fran 4, and so on. So a good week for the Brewers. They went 5-1. Let's do the St. Louis Cardinals, and then I'm going to get on out of here. All right, so we talked about the Pirates series this last week, and obviously they swept the Pirates, and then they actually got swept themselves in LA, which is why the Cubs were able to increase their division lead. And thank God LA is so good because they handled St. Louis pretty well. 8-0 in Game 1, 3-1 on Tuesday. I think that was the game Kershaw pitched, and then they won 2-1. That was the game on Wednesday, the finale, that they were actually down 1-0 heading to the bottom of the ninth. And I'm almost positive, I guess I can just click here and double check. Yeah, they walked it off in the ninth on 2 runs. LA is crazy. But anyways, a 3-3 week for the Cardinals. They did bounce back against the struggling Pirates, and they'll get to face the Royals now. 2-game series before going to Cincinnati this upcoming weekend for a 4-game set. Like I mentioned before, then they're actually going to host the Milwaukee Brewers at the start of next week on Monday through Wednesday, it looks like. A 3-game series against the Brewers at Busch Stadium. So a lot of action going on around the NL Central. I'll continue to say that it's going to be close to the very end. But with that, it's going to wrap up our 29th episode of the IV Podcast here on August 11th. I look forward to seeing you guys next week for our 30th episode as the Cubs will wrap up their 10-game road trip in Pittsburgh next weekend after the Philly series, of course, after tomorrow's off day on Monday. Next week's podcast, per usual, will be recorded on Sunday night and released then. You can access via the link in my bio at the Cubs Wave on Instagram. Make sure you guys give me a follow. I'm always updating on there. If you're not following there and you have Instagram, you're missing out because I truly have great content on there all the time surrounding game recaps, pre-games, poll questions, whatever it is, injury news, breaking news. It's all there. So if you haven't followed yet, I really would appreciate it at the Cubs Wave on Instagram. But anyways, guys, thanks as always for stopping by, and go Cubs go.